They tried to sell my home without asking, without warning, and without even owning it. I was at work when my neighbor sent me a picture. It made my stomach drop. Strangers in suits were pacing across my grandfather's cabin deck, while a realtor in high heels pointed at the place like it was already hers. My hands shook as I listened to our HOA president, Veronica, leave a smug voicemail about exploring community improvements. Improvements? No, this was theft. You don't just sell someone's property. But here's the thing. I know how to fight back. Tell me, what would you do if strangers started walking through your home like they owned it? And does this kind of HOA madness happen everywhere or only here? Let me take you back and show you how it all began. It all began on a quiet morning in a small, suburban neighborhood where people usually kept to themselves. The air felt calm, but underneath that calmness, tensions had been growing for months. My family and I had moved into this community thinking it would be the perfect place to settle down. Wide pavements, neat lawns, and homes that all looked like they had been pulled out of a glossy magazine. It gave off the perfect impression of safety and comfort. But what we didn't know was that behind that picture-perfect setting, the Homeowners Association, the so-called HOA, held more power than anyone could have imagined. The HOA wasn't just a committee of friendly neighbors managing community affairs. No, they acted more like gatekeepers, deciding who could do what, even inside their own homes. At first, we thought they were just being strict to keep the place neat. But soon we realized they thrived on control. They weren't protecting the community, they were suffocating it. It started with small things. A warning letter about our bins being visible from the road. A polite but firm notice about the color of our front door being slightly off from the accepted shade. It almost felt like they were testing us, checking how far they could push before we resisted. And when we didn't fight back immediately, they took it as an invitation to push harder. One afternoon, I came home to find a letter shoved through our door. Not the usual posted one, but hand-delivered, bold, and stamped with urgency. It stated that our garden, though neatly maintained, had unauthorized plants. Apparently, the roses my wife had planted, bright red and flourishing, were not approved by the committee. I laughed when I first read it, thinking it was some sort of joke. How could anyone have the authority to tell us which flowers we could or couldn't plant on our own property? But my wife didn't laugh. She knew their warnings carried weight. She reminded me of the stories we'd already heard from other residents, like the old couple down the road who'd been fined hundreds of pounds for leaving their holiday, decorations up 2 days past the official deadline, or the young man who was threatened with legal action because his shed was too modern compared to the rest of the neighborhood. These weren't rumors, they were warnings, and now we were next in line. I decided to attend one of their monthly HOA meetings, curious to see who exactly was behind all this. The meeting was held in the community hall, a place that should have felt welcoming, but the atmosphere was heavy the moment I walked in. A long table stretched across the front, and behind it sat the board members, most of them older, with stern expressions that never softened, not even for politeness. At the center was the president, Mrs. Caldwell. She was the type of woman who looked as though she thrived on authority. Sharp suits, perfectly styled silver hair, and a tone of voice that made everything sound like an order rather than a statement. When the floor was opened for resident concerns, I raised the issue of the rose bushes. Mrs. Caldwell didn't even let me finish. She leaned forward, narrowed her eyes, and said, "Rules exist for a reason. If every household ignored them, this community would fall into chaos." Her words hung in the air, and several board members nodded like puppets. I wanted to argue, to remind her this was meant to be our home, not a prison. But the glares from the other residents silenced me. It was clear. People were too afraid to challenge her. Walking back home that night, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about roses, or bins, or door colors. This was about control. Mrs. Caldwell and her board weren't protecting property values. They were ruling the neighborhood like dictators. And the worst part was that everyone had accepted it. either out of fear or exhaustion. Days turned into weeks, and the HOA's grip tightened. We received another notice, this time about the small garden shed at the back of our house. They claimed it hadn't been pre-approved, and therefore was a violation. I was furious. That shed had come with the property when we bought it. Yet somehow, they were twisting their rules to make it our problem. My wife begged me to let it go, to avoid confrontation, but something inside me snapped. I realized if we kept giving in, they would never stop. One Saturday morning, I decided to stand my ground. I was mowing the lawn when Mrs. Caldwell herself walked up, clipboard in hand. She didn't bother with a greeting. "You'll need to remove that shed by the end of the month," she said coldly, pointing as though she owned the land. I turned off the mower and looked her straight in the eye. "The shed isn't going anywhere. It was here before us, and it'll be here long after. You can't keep bullying people into submission." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of surprise. People rarely spoke back to her, and she wasn't used to resistance. But instead of backing down, she smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. "We'll see," she said, before turning sharply on her heel and walking away. From that moment, everything escalated. Letters came more frequently, each one more threatening than the last. Fines were issued for the most ridiculous reasons. Grass growing unevenly, curtains visible from the street. Even for leaving a bicycle leaning against the side of the house. It was clear she was targeting us personally, determined to break our will. But what Mrs. Caldwell didn't realize was that her intimidation was doing the opposite. The more she pushed, the stronger my resolve became. I started talking to other residents quietly, asking if they'd faced the same kind of harassment. To my shock, almost everyone had a story. Some had paid fines they couldn't afford, others had given up hobbies or home improvements just to avoid trouble. The community was suffocating under her rule, but no one dared to stand up, until now. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. I promised my wife I'd handle it carefully. But deep down, I understood this was only the beginning of a battle we couldn't avoid. After that confrontation with Mrs. Caldwell, things began to escalate rapidly. It wasn't just about minor rules anymore. It felt as though the HOA had declared war on anyone who dared to question their authority. That week, another envelope arrived. This one marked urgent legal notice. Inside, we found a hefty bill claiming we owed thousands in fines for non-compliance with community regulations. The fine for the garden shed had been multiplied, and we were now accused of creating a visual disturbance in the neighborhood. I felt my blood boil, but my wife reminded me to remain calm. She had learned the hard way that losing your temper in front of these people often made things worse. Instead of panicking, I decided to investigate. I spent hours going through every letter, every notice, cross-checking HOA regulations with government property laws. It became painfully clear Mrs. Caldwell and her board were bending rules to suit themselves. Every violation was either fabricated or wildly exaggerated, and each fine went directly into their personal accounts, or so it seemed. It wasn't long before I discovered that we weren't alone. Neighbors who had initially seemed indifferent started opening up. The Johnsons, who lived 3 houses down, told us about a 5-year-long harassment campaign that had cost them nearly $20,000 in fake fines. The Millers, a retired couple living at the corner, had nearly lost their home after paying fines for a non-conforming mailbox every single year. It was shocking. The community we thought we knew was being systematically exploited. By midweek, I realized that if we didn't act collectively, Mrs. Caldwell would continue to dominate and intimidate. I began quietly organizing meetings at my home, inviting residents who were willing to speak up. At first, people were hesitant, worried about retaliation. But gradually, as stories were shared, a pattern became undeniable. Every complaint, every fine, every piece of intimidation traced back to one person, Mrs. Caldwell. One evening, during one of these secret gatherings, Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher with a keen eye for detail, pulled out old bank statements and receipts he had been keeping. His voice trembled slightly as he laid out the figures. "Look at this," he said. "All these fines we paid. They didn't go to community improvements. They've been lining their own pockets." The room fell silent, shock mixed with anger. The realization hit everyone hard. We had all been duped. It was time to take the next step. We started documenting everything meticulously. Copies of letters, photographs of the violations, bank records, anything that could provide proof. Every resident who was willing contributed. What started as quiet conversations in living rooms transformed into a full-scale collection of evidence. We even installed cameras discreetly around our properties. After hearing reports of suspicious late-night activities, meanwhile, Mrs. Caldwell seemed oblivious, or perhaps overconfident. She continued her usual routine, attending HOA meetings with the same smug air, unaware that her grip was slowly slipping. At one such meeting, she tried to publicly shame the Millers for illegal construction on their property. But I noticed the room was shifting. People no longer lowered their heads in fear. Instead, whispers spread, and eyes that once avoided confrontation now locked on her. By late October, the plan was clear. We would present our findings collectively at the next official HOA meeting. But this time with concrete evidence. Our goal wasn't revenge. It was accountability. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for every family that had been bullied into silence. The night before the big meeting, I barely slept. I went through the evidence one last time, making sure everything was in order. My wife sat beside me, holding my hand, whispering encouragement. Tomorrow, they'll see what they've done. Tomorrow, people will realize they're not alone. Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of months of fear, frustration, and hope. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the countryside glow golden. The community hall quickly filled beyond expectation. Chairs were placed along the walls, yet many residents had to stand. Cameras from local news outlets were already set up, capturing the growing crowd. It was clear that word had spread. People were eager to see justice served. Mrs. Caldwell arrived late, as usual, with her personal attorney in tow. She smiled tightly, but her eyes flickered with unease as she scanned the room. It was the first time I saw her hesitate, the first time she looked unsure of her authority. Our group took our positions, ready to present, not with anger, but with undeniable facts. When the meeting began, I started by addressing the community. My voice, calm yet firm, carried across the room. For years, we've been subjected to fines, threats, and harassment under the guise of maintaining community standards. Today, we have proof that these actions were not about standards. They were about personal gain. I clicked through the first slide of our presentation. The room fell silent. There it was, detailed records showing the fines collected and where the money had gone. Bank statements, receipts, and evidence of extravagant spending, all funded by residents who had trusted the HOA to act in their best interests. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. One by one, other residents shared their stories, standing bravely in front of a crowd that finally seemed united. The Millers spoke of sleepless nights and financial strain. The Johnsons shared how they had to cancel their family holiday, just to pay fines they didn't owe. Each story added weight, turning what had once been whispers of discontent into a chorus demanding justice. Mrs. Caldwell tried to interrupt, attempting to defend herself, but this time her words felt hollow. The crowd no longer feared her. They listened politely, but the power had shifted. Evidence, truth, and community unity spoke louder than any authority she had once wielded. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The HOA's reign of intimidation had crumbled. The residents, empowered by collective courage, had taken back control of their neighborhood. People shook hands, exchanged hugs, and for the first time in months, there was laughter in the air. Fear had been replaced by a sense of shared strength and relief. The day after the HOA showdown, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow. People waved at each other across the street, stopped to chat without glancing over their shoulders, and shared knowing smiles. It was the first time in years that the community felt like a genuine community again. Not just a collection of houses under a tyrant's thumb. But the work wasn't over. Mrs. Caldwell's legal team had already sent a flurry of letters, attempting to dismiss or minimize the evidence. Most residents ignored them. But we knew the fight wasn't just about one meeting. It was about ensuring accountability. I spent hours at my kitchen table, coordinating with neighbors, compiling evidence packets, and making sure everything was backed up. Each folder we prepared was another shield against her attempts to undermine justice. Meanwhile, word spread beyond our village. Local media outlets picked up the story, highlighting the courage of ordinary residents standing up to abuse. Journalists called, requesting interviews, while social media buzzed with messages from other communities facing similar harassment. It was encouraging, knowing that our struggle could inspire others to act. One evening, I received a phone call from Mr. Thompson. "You need to see this," he said urgently. On his laptop were screenshots of bank transactions, thousands of pounds, wired to offshore accounts over several years. "This isn't just petty fines anymore," he explained. "This is systematic fraud." His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the data. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down, but also the satisfaction of finally having undeniable proof. We decided to take the next logical step, informing the authorities. With the help of a solicitor familiar with HOA cases, we compiled a formal report. Every fine, every suspicious transaction, every instance of harassment was documented with receipts, photographs, and testimonies. The solicitor advised us to submit the report to both local authorities and, due to the scale of the financial misconduct, the National Fraud Office. While waiting for official responses, the community continued its quiet, resilient pushback. Residents who had previously cowered began attending meetings and speaking up. At one particularly tense HOA meeting, Mr. Johnson, who had previously avoided confrontation, stood and asked pointed questions about where the funds had gone. The room fell silent. Mrs. Caldwell stammered, clearly unprepared. It was a small victory, but meaningful. The power dynamic had shifted, and people felt it. One morning, a few weeks later, a letter arrived from the local council. It confirmed that an investigation into the HOA's finances had officially begun. There was a sense of relief, but also anticipation. We knew the legal process could be long, and patience would be essential. Still, knowing that authorities were now involved validated all our efforts. During this period, I also focused on connecting with younger residents. Teenagers and young adults had witnessed years of fear and intimidation. Many were frustrated, feeling powerless. We organized community workshops to educate them on their rights, how to document issues, and how to speak up effectively. It was empowering for them, and for us, to see a new generation learning to stand against injustice. By late November, momentum had grown beyond our street. Neighboring villages reached out, seeking advice and support. They, too, were struggling with aggressive HOAs or property management groups. I realized that our experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a wider pattern of exploitation. Sharing knowledge became a mission. Each phone call, each email, was a chance to prevent someone else from going through the same nightmare. Back in our village, the Christmas lights went up, but the mood was different. Decorations were brighter, and families were laughing as they hung ornaments. Even though we knew legal battles could stretch into the new year, there was a sense of triumph in the air. Residents weren't just surviving, they were reclaiming their lives. On one particularly crisp evening, as I walked past the local park, I noticed elderly Mr. Kowalski teaching his grandson to kick a football. He caught my eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of what we had achieved together. These small moments, smiles, conversations, simple acts of normal life, were reminders of why we had persevered. It wasn't just about money or fines, it was about dignity and community. Then came the first real piece of news from the authorities. The formal charges. It was a mixture of relief and apprehension. Mrs. Caldwell was facing multiple counts of fraud, misuse of funds, and harassment. The legal system was finally catching up. Residents cheered quietly in local cafes, and neighbors hugged each other on the streets. For months, fear had dictated our actions. Now, justice was dictating the narrative. Preparing for the upcoming court dates required coordination. Residents who had been victims were invited to give testimonies. We organized schedules, arranged legal counsel, and rehearsed statements. Everyone wanted to ensure that when the time came, their stories were heard clearly and accurately. The sense of shared purpose was tangible. Meanwhile, our story began attracting attention from civic groups and nonprofit organizations. They offered guidance, legal advice, and, in some cases, assistance with fundraising for legal fees. It was incredible to see how one community's determination could inspire others, creating a ripple effect. On the night before the first major court hearing, I took a quiet walk by the lake. The moonlight shimmered across the water, and the loons called softly, as they had for generations. I thought of all the families, the sleepless nights, the stress, and the fear. And I realized something important. It wasn't just about punishing Mrs. Caldwell. It was about ensuring that the future of our village, and villages like ours, was protected from exploitation. Sleep was elusive, but determination was strong. I knew that no matter how long the process took, we had built something resilient, a community unwilling to be intimidated, armed with evidence, and united by shared experience. The morning of the first court appearance arrived crisp and clear. Families walked in together, filing into the local courthouse. It was a remarkable sight. Children holding hands with grandparents, couples standing side by side, neighbors who had once feared speaking up now looking proud and resolute. Cameras from local news outlets captured the scene, showing the community as it truly was. Strong, united, and ready to stand for justice. As Mrs. Caldwell was brought into the courtroom, the confident facade she had maintained for years seemed to falter. The room buzzed quietly with anticipation. Legal teams presented the evidence we had so meticulously gathered. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the mountain of documentation that detailed years of fraudulent activity. For the first time, residents weren't just observers. They were participants in a process that directly held power accountable. Each testimony, each document, each piece of photographic evidence mattered. We were witnessing justice unfold in real time, and it was profoundly satisfying. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as Mrs. Caldwell's legal team tried to deflect the evidence, but the meticulous records we had collected spoke for themselves. Every bank statement, every email, every photograph told a story of abuse, deception, and greed. Residents leaned forward in their seats, their faces tense yet resolute. For many, this was the first time in years that their fears were given weight, that their voices mattered in an official setting. Tom Martinez, who had first brought the community together, was at the front row, taking notes meticulously. He glanced at the gallery, noting familiar faces, the elderly couple who had fought off mounting fines, young parents whose savings had been drained, and neighbors who had once doubted whether speaking up could make a difference. Each testimony reinforced the collective weight of truth, and Mrs. Caldwell's defiance began to show cracks. The prosecuting solicitor stood, presenting the timeline of misappropriated funds, over $300,000 collected in HOA fees. He said, voice firm but calm, yet only $120,000 properly accounted for. The rest has been used for personal luxuries, overseas transfers, and falsified payments to non-existent services. Gasps echoed quietly around the courtroom. Neighbors exchanged glances, the numbers confirming what they had long suspected but could never prove. The most shocking revelation came when footage from security cameras at various properties was displayed. Residents watched in stunned silence as Mrs. Caldwell's actions were documented, planting false notices, manipulating property inspections, and even staging incidents to intimidate families into paying fines. It was surreal, almost cinematic, the kind of villainy you read about in newspapers but never expect to witness in your own community. One elderly gentleman, Mr. Kowalski, struggled to keep his voice steady as he recounted the stress that had led him to hospitalization. "I have lived here for 40 years without issue," he said, holding back tears. "Then she came along and made me fear my own home. She took more than money. She took peace of mind." His statement resonated deeply, a testament to the emotional and psychological toll this ordeal had taken on ordinary people. The courtroom remained silent as families shared their stories, one after another. Each tale was different. Some spoke of financial ruin, others of sleepless nights and anxiety. But the theme was the same: abuse of power cloaked as civic duty. One young mother described borrowing against her retirement, savings to pay fines that never should have existed. Another resident described having their property vandalized to coerce compliance. The systematic nature of the harassment became undeniable, and murmurs of anger rippled through the courtroom gallery. Outside, word of the trial spread quickly. Local news reporters set up outside the courthouse, broadcasting the proceedings live. Residents who couldn't attend followed updates online, posting supportive messages and sharing their own experiences. It was a ripple effect. The story of one community's courage began inspiring others to question the practices of their own HOAs. The morning session ended with the prosecution, summarizing the most critical points. "This is not a series of isolated incidents," the solicitor emphasized. "This is a coordinated pattern of behavior that has systematically defrauded, intimidated, and harassed residents for years." Every person in that courtroom felt the weight of those words. During the lunch break, families gathered outside the courthouse, sharing reflections and offering support. The atmosphere was lighter than expected. Conversations included laughter, relief, and stories of resilience. It was a rare moment of normalcy in the midst of what had been a harrowing journey. People spoke not only of the past, but of hope for the future, imagining a community free from fear and corruption. By early afternoon, the focus shifted to the defense. Mrs. Caldwell's lawyer attempted to downplay the evidence, suggesting that discrepancies were administrative errors and that residents had misinterpreted notices. But the careful documentation we had prepared left little room for doubt. Witnesses calmly but firmly refuted each claim. The contrast between the clear, factual evidence and the vague, defensive arguments of the legal team was stark. One pivotal moment came when Roy Patterson, a respected elder in the community and a former Army officer, took the stand. His presence alone commanded attention. He recounted how the HOA's actions had not only harmed families financially but had eroded trust, broken relationships, and sown fear. "We are not here to seek revenge," he said, voice steady and authoritative. "We are here to ensure that communities like ours can protect themselves from those who abuse power. We stand together, not out of anger, but out of responsibility." The judge listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification, but the testimony was powerful enough to leave a lasting impression. Many in the gallery wiped tears from their eyes, touched by the courage and sincerity of ordinary citizens standing up to extraordinary wrongdoing. Even as the day drew to a close, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of purpose. Families who had once felt powerless now felt empowered. Neighbors who had been silent for years were finding their voices. And somewhere, in the heart of the community, a quiet satisfaction settled. Justice, finally, was no longer a distant hope. It was unfolding before their eyes. As we left the courthouse that evening, the streets felt lighter, the crisp air carrying a sense of promise. Conversations among residents revolved around the future, how to prevent such abuses, how to educate younger generations, and how to maintain the solidarity that had carried them this far. The trials were not just legal battles. They were lessons in community, resilience, and the importance of vigilance. Back at home, I reflected on the journey so far. Months of stress, sleepless nights, and relentless determination had led to this point. And yet, there was more work ahead. Court sessions would continue, evidence would still need to be examined, and the final verdict was yet to be delivered. But for the first time in years, hope outweighed fear. That night, as the village settled into quiet, homes glowing with warm lights. I realized something profound. Courage was contagious. One family's decision to document and stand up had inspired hundreds. One act of resistance had grown into a collective movement, proving that ordinary people, when united, could challenge even the most entrenched abuse of power. Even as we prepared for the next day's proceedings, there was a sense of calm determination. Residents were ready, not just to witness justice, but to participate in it. The story of our village, once marred by fear and intimidation, was being rewritten. And this time, the narrative was one of courage, unity, and the unshakable belief that wrongdoing, no matter how deeply entrenched, could not prevail against a community that refused to be silent. The following morning, the atmosphere in Willowbrook was electric. Families gathered early outside the community hall, exchanging greetings, sharing coffee, and quietly steeling themselves for what promised to be a pivotal day. News crews were already setting up cameras, their tripods and microphones signaling that the story of our small village's fight against corruption was about to reach a wider audience. Inside, the courtroom hummed with anticipation. The prosecution began the day by focusing on the personal enrichment of Mrs. Caldwell, detailing a lifestyle funded entirely by residents' fees. Luxurious overseas vacations, designer clothing, and extravagant home renovations, all meticulously documented, painted a stark picture of greed. Witnesses provided accounts of noticing sudden changes. A neighbor's property left uncared for while expensive cars and renovations appeared at Mrs. Caldwell's residence. The contrast between the community's struggling families and her opulent life only intensified the anger, simmering beneath polite nods and restrained murmurs in the courtroom. Tom Martinez took the stand once again, providing a chronological account of the harassment campaign. He described the fines levied for petty or fabricated violations, flower pots deemed non-compliant, garden sheds requiring permits that never existed, and flags that supposedly violated obscure HOA rules. Each example was accompanied by documentation, emails, and photographs, leaving no room for ambiguity. The crowd reacted audibly, some whispering words of disbelief, others shaking their heads in anger. The reality of what had happened to so many people in our village began to fully sink in. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from families who shared the emotional impact of the harassment. A young couple spoke about sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the fear of losing their home. They described the emotional toll of being trapped in a system that seemed designed to punish rather than protect residents. Their honesty resonated with the courtroom. Many nodded, recognizing their own struggles mirrored in these stories. One particularly moving testimony came from an elderly widow, Mrs. Thompson, who recounted the humiliation of receiving threatening notices for minor garden issues. "I've lived here for decades, tending my garden with love," she said, her voice trembling. "And yet I was made to feel like a criminal in my own home. I never imagined my neighbors would see this as a personal battle, but it was." Her statement drew sympathetic murmurs from the gallery and underscored the human cost of Mrs. Caldwell's actions. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the community rallied. Families who could not attend gathered at a local cafe, following live updates streamed online. They shared stories of resilience and support, bolstering one another. The sense of unity was palpable. Even those who had been silent for years began to speak up, sharing their experiences and offering advice. The ordeal, while harrowing, was forging bonds that would last far beyond the resolution of the trial. Back in the courtroom, the defense attempted to challenge the validity of the financial records. They argued that administrative errors could explain discrepancies, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that no one had proof Mrs. Caldwell personally benefited. But the prosecution's evidence was meticulous. Receipts, transfer records, photographs of luxury goods purchased, and even travel itineraries were presented in chronological order. The clarity of the evidence left little room for doubt. At this point, Roy Patterson was called to testify again. His reputation in the community lent credibility to every word he spoke. "This is not just about money," he stated. his voice steady and commanding. "It's about the trust we place in one another. When someone exploits that trust, they damage the very fabric of our community. We cannot allow fear and greed to silence us." His words resonated deeply with everyone in the room, reminding them why they had fought for so long. The afternoon session shifted focus to the fraudulent documentation Mrs. Caldwell had filed with local authorities. False compliance reports, inaccurate violation notices, and fabricated inspection records were all presented. Residents leaned forward as they recognized their own experiences, reflected in the documents. Families who had once doubted the extent of her misconduct saw their suspicions confirmed in black and white. The courtroom seemed to collectively breathe a mixture of relief and vindication. During a brief recess, neighbors gathered in small groups to discuss the progress of the trial. There was cautious optimism in the air. Everyone agreed that the path to justice was long and stressful, but today's proceedings had proven that their efforts were not in vain. Residents shared tips on documentation, discussed preventative measures for future HOA activities, and even brainstormed ideas for community events to rebuild trust and camaraderie. When the trial resumed, the focus turned to the final piece of evidence: the video footage. Security cameras had captured Mrs. Caldwell personally enforcing the fake violations, intimidating residents, and even attempting to manipulate property conditions to create the appearance of non-compliance. The footage was undeniable, clear, detailed, and unmistakable. The courtroom gallery reacted in shock, some gasping audibly, others whispering words of disbelief. It was one thing to hear about misconduct. It was another to witness it in action. The day concluded with the prosecution summarizing the case. They emphasized the systematic nature of Mrs. Caldwell's abuse. 3 years of orchestrated harassment, financial theft, and psychological intimidation. "This is more than fraud," the solicitor concluded. "It is a violation of every principle a community relies upon. It is a betrayal of trust, and it must be addressed with the full weight of the law." Applause quietly rippled through the courtroom, a rare but heartfelt expression of collective support. As we left the building that evening, the crisp autumn air felt invigorating. Neighbors exchanged words of encouragement, promising to attend the next day's proceedings. The trial was far from over, but the sense of purpose had never been stronger. People were no longer isolated, no longer intimidated, and no longer fearful. There was an unspoken understanding that justice was within reach. At home, I reflected on the day's events. Months of preparation, research, and tireless advocacy had culminated in a courtroom, full of witnesses and irrefutable evidence. The journey had been arduous, but the unity of our village had proven that ordinary citizens could challenge even the most entrenched abuse of power. And while the legal battle was ongoing, a broader lesson had already been realized. Courage, documentation, and solidarity could overcome fear and corruption. The sun set over Willowbrook, casting golden light across the lake. For the first time in years, the water looked serene, untroubled, and reflective of the resilience of the community. The trial was far from over, but the seeds of change had been sown. Families walked home with renewed hope. Their conversations focused on the future rather than past grievances. The unity that had grown from months of hardship now became a foundation for lasting strength. The following morning dawned crisp and quiet, the kind of October day that made Willowbrook feel almost cinematic. A light mist hovered over the lake, reflecting the warm orange glow of the rising sun. Despite the beauty, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Today was the day the remaining evidence against Mrs. Caldwell would be presented, the day we hoped the courtroom would see the full extent of her deception. Residents arrived early, many carrying folders of documents, photographs, and personal notes. Some had been up most of the night, ensuring every detail of their experiences was documented and ready. The atmosphere was a mix of anxiety and determination. People were nervous, but they were ready to stand together. Even those who had been silent for years felt empowered by the collective courage of their neighbors. Inside the hall, the prosecution opened with a timeline of Mrs. Caldwell's abuses. Each incident was methodically described, accompanied by visual aids, charts detailing financial discrepancies, photographs showing neglected community property, juxtaposed with her personal luxuries, and letters threatening residents for minor or invented violations. The clarity of the evidence left little room for doubt, and murmurs of disbelief spread through the room. One particularly striking moment came when the solicitor highlighted how Mrs. Caldwell had manipulated local authorities. False reports were submitted under the guise of compliance inspections, creating an illusion of legitimacy for her actions. Families leaned forward, recognizing their own experiences in the documents presented. The deception wasn't just about money, it was about control and fear. The court seemed to collectively shudder at the audacity of it all. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting clerical errors and misinterpretation of records. But the prosecution countered each point with precision. Bank statements showed transfers to luxury accounts, receipts confirmed purchases unrelated to community services, and witness testimony revealed a clear pattern of intimidation. The court watched in silent awe as a narrative of greed and abuse unfolded, each layer more damning than the last. Next, the focus shifted to Mrs. Caldwell's direct harassment. Testimonies came from families who had endured weeks, months, and even years of stress under her rule. One young mother described sleepless nights and panic, attacks triggered by threats of fines she could not afford. "I felt trapped," she said, her voice quivering, like there was no escape. "And every time I tried to speak up, I was silenced or intimidated." Her words resonated deeply, reminding everyone of the human cost behind financial fraud. Elderly residents spoke too, many leaning heavily on walking sticks or oxygen tanks. They recounted how they had been forced to pay for fabricated violations, some even mortgaging their homes to meet demands. One gentleman, Ed Kowalski, described the emotional toll of watching his life. Savings vanish while the community he loved crumbled under fear and mistrust. His hands shook as he held his documents, but his voice carried strength. "I may be old, but I will not be silenced. Not now, not ever." The courtroom was silent, moved by his courage. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, community members were following the proceedings through live streams. Cafes, local parks, and even living rooms filled with people tracking the updates. Conversations buzzed with hope and excitement, and a sense of unity grew stronger. Families shared advice on documenting HOA activity, exchanged contact information for support, and discussed ways to ensure such abuses could be prevented in the future. The ordeal, while painful, had sparked a powerful movement of grassroots accountability. Back inside, the video evidence was presented again, but this time in more detail. Security footage captured Mrs. Caldwell visiting properties late at night, removing or tampering with items and filing false reports. The clarity of the footage left the courtroom in stunned silence. It was impossible to deny the evidence. Even the most skeptical observers were forced to confront the truth. Gasps and whispers filled the room as residents recognized moments they had only previously feared to recall. The prosecution then brought in expert testimony on financial forensics. A specialist outlined how transactions had been routed through multiple accounts, both domestically and overseas, in attempts to hide the theft. The expert explained each step in plain language, ensuring that even those unfamiliar with complex financial systems could understand the deliberate nature of the fraud. This testimony tied together the evidence presented so far, reinforcing the case that Mrs. Caldwell had orchestrated a systematic, multi-year scheme to exploit the community. One of the most emotional moments came when the Morrison family spoke. Forced to sell their cottage after enduring months of harassment, they shared photos and letters detailing the ordeal. The daughter, barely holding back tears, described how their home, once a place of joy, had become a source of anxiety and fear. "We loved this place," she said, her voice trembling. "And she took that from us." Their story struck a chord, illustrating that the impact of Mrs. Caldwell's actions extended far beyond finances. It had deeply affected lives and relationships. As the day wore on, the courtroom absorbed the sheer weight of the evidence. Each testimony, each document, each photograph and video clip added to a comprehensive portrait of abuse, fraud, and intimidation. The atmosphere was tense but resolute. Residents and observers alike were fully engaged, bearing witness to the unraveling of a reign built on fear. Finally, the prosecution summarized the evidence for the day. They reminded the court that this case wasn't just about recovering funds, but about restoring trust, dignity, and justice to a community that had been silenced for too long. We are here not only to seek justice for those who have suffered, the solicitor concluded, but to set a precedent that ensures this can never happen again. The words were met with quiet, heartfelt applause from those in the courtroom who understood the importance of the message. As residents filed out into the late afternoon sun, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The day had been exhausting, emotionally draining, but empowering. Families shared words of encouragement, reflecting on the courage of those who had spoken and the growing strength of the community. Even those who had once felt powerless were beginning to see that their voices, combined, could wield incredible influence. That evening, I walked along the edge of the lake, the water reflecting the amber and gold hues of the setting sun. The serenity of the scene contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the courtroom, yet it was a reminder of why we were fighting. Willowbrook was more than a village. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a community worth defending. The trial was far from over, but every day, every piece of evidence, and every act of courage was bringing justice closer to our door. The morning air carried a crisp chill as residents gathered again at the Willowbrook Community Hall. After yesterday's exhaustive courtroom sessions, everyone arrived with a renewed sense of purpose. Conversations buzzed with anticipation, neighbors sharing theories about what evidence would emerge next, and how each revelation might finally hold Mrs. Caldwell accountable. Families had brought notes, photographs, and even copies of old HOA notices, each piece a testament to the vigilance they had maintained over months of harassment. By mid-morning, the hall was filled to capacity. Standing room was scarce, and the occasional visitor peered through windows, desperate to witness the proceedings. Local media crews were already present, cameras rolling as reporters prepared for another day of live coverage. There was an unspoken understanding that this trial had become more than just a legal matter. It had transformed into a symbol of community resilience, a story of ordinary people standing up to systemic abuse. The judge entered, and a hush fell over the room. Everyone knew that today's session would be pivotal. The prosecution began by focusing on the financial irregularities that had already shocked the community. What was new this morning, however, was the introduction of corroborating testimonies from former HOA board members. These individuals, previously reluctant to speak, recounted meetings where Mrs. Caldwell had manipulated votes, falsified records, and coerced members into compliance. The courtroom listened intently as they described tactics meant to intimidate dissenters, from subtle threats to outright harassment. One former board member, Janet Reeves, recounted the moment she discovered a series of unexplained bank withdrawals. Her voice trembled, but determination shone through. "I tried to question it," she said, and she made it clear that questioning her would come with consequences. "I feared for my position, my reputation, and even my home." The court remained silent, hanging on every word. Residents murmured amongst themselves, recognizing patterns they had endured firsthand. The narrative of abuse was becoming increasingly irrefutable. Then came the personal testimonies. The Patterson family shared how they had been targeted after complaining about missing community funds. They described letters threatening legal action for supposed violations, fines that multiplied inexplicably, and late-night calls that left them sleepless. "It was more than just money," Mr. Patterson said. "It was fear. Every time we tried to assert our rights, we were punished. It was like living under constant surveillance, and no one was allowed to speak." His daughter, holding back tears, added, "I remember looking at our home and wondering if it would ever feel safe again." The prosecution's strategy was meticulous. Each testimony was supported by evidence, documents, photographs, even audio recordings of threatening phone calls. The courtroom's atmosphere was heavy with emotion, but also with anticipation. Everyone knew the weight of what was being revealed. This wasn't a minor dispute. It was a systematic campaign of manipulation, fraud, and fear. At one point, a slideshow displayed the contrast between community funds and Mrs. Caldwell's personal expenditures. While residents struggled to maintain gardens, playgrounds, and community spaces, her own lifestyle was lavish. Receipts for luxury vacations, spa treatments, and designer clothing were juxtaposed against crumbling park benches and neglected roads. The room erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Some residents whispered in shock. Others shook their heads in anger. The injustice was impossible to ignore. As the day progressed, the focus shifted to Mrs. Caldwell's direct actions against individual families. Security footage and photographs documented instances of property tampering, unauthorized fines, and staged violations. One of the most jarring pieces of evidence showed her manipulating property markers late at night, an action designed to intimidate and confuse homeowners. The clarity of the footage left the courtroom in stunned silence. This, the prosecution emphasized, is not a misunderstanding. It is a deliberate, calculated attempt to control and exploit this community. A highlight of the day came when Ed Kowalski stood to speak again. Despite his frailty and reliance on a walking frame, he recounted the emotional and financial toll Mrs. Caldwell's actions had taken. "I have lived in Willowbrook for decades," he said, voice steady despite age and stress. "I never imagined that someone could use their position to hurt so many. But today, we are witnessing justice, and that is worth every fear we endured." His words resonated deeply, not just in the courtroom, but across the town, as neighbors shared the live stream with friends and family unable to attend. Meanwhile, discussions outside the courtroom grew increasingly practical. Families compared notes, shared advice on documenting HOA activities, and strategized ways to prevent such abuses in the future. It was as if a light had been switched on across them. Willowbrook residents realized that knowledge, preparation, and unity were their most effective tools against corruption. A sense of empowerment spread, one conversation at a time. The session ended with the prosecution summarizing key points: financial fraud, intimidation, manipulation of community governance, and direct harassment. Every piece of evidence had a clear, traceable link to Mrs. Caldwell. The impact on families, finances, and neighborhood trust was undeniable. Applause broke out quietly in the courtroom, a collective sigh of relief for those who had waited years for the truth to emerge. Walking home that evening, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. Willowbrook had endured a storm of deception and abuse. Yet the community was emerging stronger. Neighbors greeted each other with renewed warmth, sharing encouraging words and promising to continue supporting one another. There was a sense that this battle, while far from over, had set a precedent. People understood that standing together, armed with facts, documentation, and determination, could change outcomes and protect their homes. As I looked out over the lake, the reflection of the sunset danced on the water's surface. It was a reminder that even after darkness, light could return. The trial had not only begun to expose Mrs. Caldwell's wrongdoings, but had also ignited a movement of awareness and solidarity that extended far beyond Willowbrook. The community was learning that vigilance, courage, and unity were more than just ideals. They were actionable tools that could protect families, homes, and values. That night, as the stars began to shimmer above the lake, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Willowbrook was waking up to its power, its voice, and its strength. The journey was far from finished, but each revelation, each testimony, and each act of courage was building a foundation for justice, accountability, and long-lasting change. The next morning, the atmosphere in Willowbrook was electric. Residents gathered once again at the community hall, this time arriving earlier than before. News of the previous day's revelations had spread like wildfire, with word of mouth, social media, and local news outlets ensuring that everyone knew the scale of Mrs. Caldwell's deceit. By 9 a.m., the hall was packed, and many families had to stand in the corridor just to hear proceedings. The energy was a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and hope. Hope that the coming day would bring further clarity and justice. The prosecution opened with the most compelling evidence yet: documented communications that revealed a web of manipulation and intimidation. Emails, letters, and recorded calls demonstrated not only financial malfeasance, but also psychological tactics aimed at silencing dissenting residents. The evidence showed patterns of selective enforcement, where minor infractions were punished harshly if the complainant had opposed Mrs. Caldwell, while friends and allies went unchecked. The courtroom murmured as neighbors recognized the methods used to terrorize them over months, even years. One particularly poignant testimony came from the Morrison family. They described sleepless nights worrying about fines that had been fabricated overnight, threatening letters demanding thousands of pounds, and relentless pressure that eventually forced them to sell their beloved cottage. Mrs. Morrison's voice shook as she recounted, "It felt like every step we took. She was there, watching, waiting, ready to punish us. Our home, which should have been our sanctuary, became a place of fear." The room was silent, absorbing the weight of her words. For many in attendance, these stories mirrored their own experiences, forming a collective narrative of betrayal. Then the prosecution shifted, focused to the personal enrichment Mrs. Caldwell had gained from her position. A detailed breakdown revealed luxury expenditures that contrasted sharply with the state of community services. While playgrounds fell into disrepair, streetlights malfunctioned, and community events were canceled due to lack of funding. Mrs. Caldwell had been traveling, dining at high-end restaurants, and booking exclusive retreats abroad. Her ostentatious lifestyle, funded by stolen HOA fees, was laid bare for everyone to see. Neighbors whispered, shaking their heads in disbelief and anger, recognizing the audacity of her actions. A highlight of the morning was the presentation of security footage from multiple properties. One video showed Mrs. Caldwell late at night inspecting homes and tampering with property markers, an act intended to intimidate and create confusion. Another video captured her planting evidence to falsely accuse a family of violations. The clarity of the footage left no room for doubt. Gasps echoed through the hall as the community watched the very person who had terrorized them appear on screen. Caught in the act, for some, it was vindication. For others, a chilling reminder of what they had endured. Then came the emotional testimonies from elderly residents. Many spoke of stress-induced health problems caused by Mrs. Caldwell's harassment. Mr. Ed Kowalski described the anxiety that had plagued him for months. The nights spent worrying about fines and legal threats. "I thought I would lose my home," he admitted. Every day was a battle, not just for me, but for every neighbor she decided to target. But seeing everyone here today, standing up together, I finally feel some relief. His words resonated throughout the hall, a testament to the strength of the community in the face of systematic abuse. The courtroom also heard from young parents who had borrowed against future savings to pay fabricated fines. Their stories highlighted the ripple effect of Mrs. Caldwell's actions, where the financial burden extended beyond immediate victims to affect children, education, and family stability. Each testimony added another layer to the narrative, illustrating how a single corrupt individual had disrupted the lives of dozens of families. In the afternoon, the prosecution introduced evidence of cross-state activities. Mrs. Caldwell had used mail fraud and wire transfers to move funds internationally, exposing her actions to federal scrutiny. This revelation shifted the trial's tone, elevating it from a local dispute to a case of serious criminal and federal significance. FBI agent Rebecca Torres addressed the court, explaining how these actions violated federal law and outlining the potential penalties Mrs. Caldwell faced. The audience listened intently, realizing the gravity of the situation and the comprehensive nature of the legal battle ahead. By late afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell finally attempted to speak, her voice trembling as she addressed the courtroom. "These are misunderstandings," she began. But she was immediately interrupted by the presiding judge, who reminded her of her right to remain silent. The judge's intervention underscored the seriousness of the charges and prevented further attempts to obfuscate the facts. Residents watched closely, many feeling a sense of closure as the courtroom maintained control over the proceedings. As the session concluded, there was a palpable shift in the room's energy. Families who had previously felt powerless were now emboldened. Conversations among neighbors turned to practical discussions on protecting their properties, verifying HOA documentation, and ensuring that future boards would be held accountable. It was clear that the trial's impact extended beyond legal consequences. It was changing the culture of the community, empowering residents to actively participate in governance and oversight. Walking home that evening, I felt the weight of the day settle in. Willowbrook had faced months of manipulation, intimidation, and financial abuse, yet the community's unity was proving stronger than fear. Conversations lingered in my mind. The courage of elderly residents, the resolve of young families, and the clarity brought by irrefutable evidence. It was a reminder that justice, though delayed, could prevail when ordinary people refused to remain silent. As night fell, the lights of Willowbrook glimmered across the lake, reflecting the calm after a storm. There was a sense that the tide was turning, that the days of fear and oppression were giving way to transparency, accountability, and hope. Residents were no longer mere witnesses to corruption. They were participants in reclaiming their homes, their community, and their dignity. That evening, as I watched the stars above the lake, a quiet determination settled within me. The trial was far from over, but each revelation, each testimony, and each moment of courage was reshaping Willowbrook's future. The community had learned that unity, preparation, and vigilance were essential in the fight against corruption. And most importantly, we understood that speaking up, together, was the most powerful tool we possessed. The following morning, a crisp autumn wind swept through Willowbrook as residents gathered once more outside the community hall. Rumors had already begun circulating about what would unfold in the next stage of the trial. Families lined up early, not only to witness justice, but to show solidarity with one another. Even those who had initially been hesitant to step forward were now present, emboldened by the courage of neighbors who had shared their stories the previous day. The town had changed overnight. Fear was being replaced with determination. Inside the hall, the legal teams prepared meticulously. District Attorney Sarah Butler reviewed files with her team, while Federal Agent Rebecca Torres coordinated with local authorities to ensure that every piece of evidence was accurately presented. Tom Martinez, the community representative, quietly went over his notes, ready to guide residents through the proceedings and offer moral support. There was a tangible sense of collaboration, a coming together of professionals and citizens alike, united in the pursuit of truth. The morning session began with a focus on the financial trail. Evidence detailed how Mrs. Caldwell had siphoned community funds into personal accounts, covering extravagant expenses that included luxury vacations, high-end shopping sprees, and payments for services that were entirely unrelated to the maintenance or improvement of Willowbrook. Charts, spreadsheets, and bank statements illuminated the vast scale of the fraud, leaving the audience in awe at the audacity of her schemes. Whispered comments filled the room. Disbelief, anger, and vindication all mingling together. Next came testimony from financial experts, who explained in simple terms how the manipulation had been carried out. They illustrated the systematic nature of the embezzlement, showing patterns that were too consistent to be accidental. They also explained how residents' attempts to question fees or challenge violations had been deliberately thwarted, further emphasizing the calculated nature of Mrs. Caldwell's actions. Neighbors leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the clarity and thoroughness of the presentation. For many, it was the first time the full scope of the betrayal was made comprehensible. Then came the heart-wrenching stories of families directly affected by the harassment. Young parents described sleepless nights, the anxiety of receiving threatening letters, and the struggle to provide stability for their children while dealing with fabricated fines and legal threats. Elderly residents recounted health crises and the emotional toll of constant intimidation. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, wept as she described how she had been forced to sell her beloved garden to pay for a so-called compliance violation. Each story added weight to the case, humanizing the abstract numbers and charts that had dominated the morning session. The mid-morning session shifted to the more dramatic evidence, videos and photographs showing Mrs. Caldwell engaging in intimidation tactics. Security footage revealed her entering neighborhoods under the cover of darkness, inspecting properties, and even planting false evidence to incriminate innocent families. The visuals were undeniable, leaving the community in stunned silence. Some gasped audibly, while others shook their heads, silently acknowledging the courage it had taken to finally bring these actions into the light. One of the most powerful moments of the day came when young Mackenzie, who had been directly involved in collecting evidence, stood before the crowd to speak. "I've seen how fear can stop people from speaking up," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "But when we work together, when we refuse to stay silent, we become stronger than those who try to control us. This is about more than just one person. It's about protecting every family in Willowbrook from abuse." Her words resonated throughout the hall, a reminder that bravery and collective action could overcome even the most calculated intimidation. As afternoon approached, the focus shifted to the legal ramifications of Mrs. Caldwell's actions. District Attorney Butler outlined the charges: multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, racketeering, and conspiracy. The severity of the accusations, combined with federal oversight, meant that Mrs. Caldwell faced serious prison time and significant restitution. Residents listened intently as Butler explained how the justice system would ensure accountability and protect their community from future exploitation. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, but also with hope, as the prospect of resolution began to feel tangible. During a brief break, neighbors gathered in clusters outside the hall, discussing what they had witnessed. Conversations ranged from strategies to prevent future abuse to personal reflections on the courage it took to stand up. A sense of camaraderie had taken root, transforming a once-divided community into a united front. Families shared contact information, promising to stay connected and support each other, ensuring that the lessons of this trial would carry forward into the governance of their homes and the protection of their neighborhood. The afternoon session ended with a particularly striking presentation, a timeline detailing the cumulative effects of Mrs. Caldwell's actions over the past 3 years. Each month highlighted specific abuses, showing a consistent pattern of harassment and financial exploitation. Residents were able to connect individual experiences to the larger picture, understanding how widespread the impact had been. The evidence was irrefutable, and the courtroom seemed to collectively exhale, recognizing that justice was now within reach. As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Caldwell sat quietly, her usual air of confidence replaced by tension and unease. Her legal team whispered amongst themselves, clearly aware of the magnitude of the evidence against their client. The community watched with satisfaction, understanding that the system was finally holding her accountable. For many, seeing her subdued and under scrutiny was a form of closure after months of fear and uncertainty. Walking home that evening, I couldn't help but notice the small but significant changes in the neighborhood. Residents greeted each other warmly, conversations were lively, and a sense of mutual support permeated the streets. Willowbrook was no longer a place where fear dictated behavior. Instead, it was a community actively reclaiming its voice and power. There was a quiet optimism in the air, a shared understanding that the struggle for justice was not just legal but also communal. That night, I reflected on the courage displayed by neighbors, friends, and even young children who had contributed to collecting evidence and speaking out. The trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a story of ordinary people standing up to corruption, of communities discovering strength in unity, and of the transformative power of collective action. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, and each moment of courage had brought us closer to the justice we had longed for. As I drifted off to sleep, the crisp November air carrying the scent of autumn leaves, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for a community that refused to be intimidated, for the dedication of the legal teams, and for the courage of neighbors who had chosen to speak out. Willowbrook was healing, not just financially but emotionally and socially. And while the trial was far from over, it was clear that the spirit of the community had been irreversibly strengthened. The next morning, a crisp fog hung over Willowbrook, giving the streets an almost ethereal quality. The town had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet there was a quiet buzz in the air, a sense that things were far from over. News outlets were already reporting the previous day's developments, and residents kept stopping one another on the sidewalks, discussing what they had witnessed. The story of Mrs. Caldwell's crimes had captured not only the attention of the local community, but also that of the broader region. Inside the community hall, preparations were underway for the continuation of the trial. This session was focused on verifying the restitution process, ensuring that every penny stolen would be accounted for and returned to the rightful owners. Financial analysts and investigators had spent the last few weeks tracing Mrs. Caldwell's complex web of accounts, from offshore funds to hidden investments. The hall was set up with large screens displaying graphs, maps, and detailed flowcharts of how the embezzled funds had traveled over state lines. Residents craned their necks to follow every step, eager to see their money finally coming home. Tom Martinez stood at the front, guiding the community through the details. His calm voice provided reassurance amidst the overwhelming amount of information. "What you're seeing here is more than just numbers," he explained. "This is the story of our perseverance. Every dollar recovered represents a family that was able to sleep a little easier, a neighbor that no longer lives in fear, a child whose home is now secure." Murmurs of agreement spread through the audience, and for the first time, the magnitude of the impact felt personal and tangible. Then came the most compelling testimonies of the day, families recounting how the restitution process had changed their lives. The Patterson family, once on the verge of foreclosure, described paying off debts and finally being able to plan a small family vacation. Mr. Kowalski shared that he had been able to retire peacefully, the burden of fake fines lifted from his shoulders. Young couples who had feared losing their homes spoke of the emotional weight being removed, and children smiled, holding tightly to their parents' hands as they listened. It was more than financial relief. It was validation, acknowledgement, and healing. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with emotion as Tom then shared the final pieces of evidence regarding Mrs. Caldwell's federal violations. Wire transfers, mail fraud, and interstate financial manipulation had placed her squarely under federal jurisdiction, adding another layer of accountability. Agent Rebecca Torres explained in clear, concise terms the implications of these charges. Mrs. Caldwell's actions were not just local mismanagement, she said. They were systematic, organized, and designed to exploit multiple communities. Federal involvement ensures that justice is thorough and binding. Residents nodded, understanding the significance and feeling reassured that the law was catching up to someone who had long operated with impunity. The highlight of the afternoon was a demonstration of community resilience. A series of slides and short videos showed neighbors organizing watch groups, holding regular meetings and documenting their own HOA records. This visual narrative was incredibly powerful, showing that Willowbrook had not only fought back but had also built mechanisms to prevent future abuses. Tom explained, "We've learned from mistakes. Yes, but more importantly, we've created systems that protect our rights, ensure transparency, and keep our leaders accountable." Applause filled the room, and even some of the previously fearful residents smiled, sensing empowerment for the first time in years. Meanwhile, outside the hall, journalists and community members gathered, discussing the broader implications of the case. Stories were emerging of other small towns facing similar challenges, and reporters were keen to draw connections to Willowbrook's experience. Some residents were interviewed on local radio, sharing how the courage of a few had sparked a movement that extended well beyond their own streets. The sense of responsibility was palpable. People recognized that their fight for justice could serve as a blueprint for others, transforming a local struggle into a symbol of nationwide accountability. Later, as the legal session wrapped up, Mrs. Caldwell sat quietly at the back, visibly exhausted and anxious. Her legal team whispered constantly, but their attempts at consolation were met with blank stares. It was clear to everyone watching that the power she had once wielded so effortlessly had been stripped away, replaced by the weight of undeniable evidence and public scrutiny. For the residents of Willowbrook, seeing her subdued was a moment of collective relief, a visual affirmation that their months of courage and persistence were beginning to yield real results. After the session, Tom gathered a small group of community leaders to discuss next steps. Topics ranged from maintaining oversight of the HOA's operations to creating educational programs for residents on their rights and responsibilities. Plans were also set in motion to create a memorial to commemorate the resilience of the Willowbrook community, a symbolic gesture to remind everyone that the fight against corruption was not just necessary but noble. Every decision made in that room reflected a renewed commitment to transparency, justice, and collective empowerment. As evening descended, families returned to their homes, carrying with them a mix of relief, hope, and renewed determination. Conversations at dinner tables focused not on fear, but on strategies to maintain vigilance and safeguard the community. Children drew pictures of happy neighborhoods, unaware of the full complexity of the legal proceedings, but sensing the palpable change in the atmosphere. Parents quietly discussed the lessons they hoped their children would carry forward, the importance of speaking up, working together, and refusing to let injustice prevail. That night I sat on the porch overlooking the lake, the water calm and reflective under the moonlight. The distant calls of loons, once symbols of peace in our quiet community, now seemed to carry the weight of triumph as well. Months of anxiety, sleepless nights, and relentless advocacy had culminated in a day that not only restored justice, but also strengthened the bonds between neighbors. For the first time in years, Willowbrook felt whole, unified, and protected. As I sipped my tea and watched the mist curl above the lake, I reflected on the journey, the trial, the community organizing, the tireless efforts of every individual who had spoken out. They were all part of a larger story, one that spoke to the power of ordinary people rising against extraordinary corruption. It was a story of resilience, hope, and the tangible impact of courage. The work was not yet complete, but the momentum was undeniable. The night deepened, and the lights from homes flickered across the water, a quiet reminder that life, in all its ordinary beauty, had reclaimed its rightful place. Willowbrook was not just surviving, it was thriving, emboldened by the knowledge that justice had been fought for, won, and shared. And in the quiet moments, it became clear that the community had gained something far greater than money or restitution. It had regained its dignity, its voice, and the unshakable belief that together it could overcome any challenge. The next morning, Willowbrook awoke to a sense of renewed purpose. The newspapers and social media feeds were alive, with stories of the community's triumph over Mrs. Caldwell's deceit, and residents began to see their town through a new lens. No longer just a quiet, small-town backwater, Willowbrook had become a symbol of vigilance, unity, and the strength of ordinary citizens standing together. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations about the previous day's proceedings, parents shared what they had learned with their children, and neighbors stopped on the streets to discuss plans for a stronger, safer community. Tom Martinez and a few other residents met early in the community center to continue the work they had started. The primary focus was creating a structured oversight committee for the Willowbrook Neighborhood Association. Everyone agreed that without a clear system for transparency, the mistakes of the past could easily be repeated. Tom laid out a detailed plan that included monthly audits, public reporting of finances, and rotating leadership positions to prevent any single individual from gaining too much control. We need to make sure our voices are heard at every step, he explained. We're not just reacting to corruption. We're building a system that protects our future. Meanwhile, legal teams worked on finalizing the restitution process. Financial analysts meticulously traced every transaction that Mrs. Caldwell had orchestrated, from offshore accounts to personal indulgences. The results were staggering. Over $2.8 million had been recovered, including punitive damages designed to compensate victims fully. Families who had been forced to sell homes, defer medical treatments, or go without basic necessities were finally seeing the fruits of their courage. Elderly residents like Ed Kowalski could breathe freely, while younger families finally felt secure in their homes. The numbers on a page became real-life transformations in people's lives, each dollar representing relief, justice, and closure. The community center was also hosting educational workshops. Residents of all ages learned about HOA regulations, their rights under the law, and practical strategies for preventing future abuse. Local lawyers, including Tom, volunteered their time to teach these sessions, emphasizing the importance of record-keeping, transparency, and community vigilance. Children participated in age-appropriate activities, learning the value of fairness, justice, and standing up for what's right. The atmosphere was one of empowerment, as neighbors realized they were no longer powerless. They had tools, knowledge, and a network of support to protect themselves and their community. One particularly moving moment came when Fletcher's grandson visited the Willowbrook Memorial Garden, now fully restored and expanded. Volunteers had planted wildflowers, erected benches, and polished the granite stones that bore the names of local veterans. The garden was not just a memorial, it had become a symbol of resilience. Families visited together, children running through the paths, while older residents reflected quietly by the memorial stones. The garden served as a tangible reminder that community effort could create beauty, honor the past, and safeguard the future. Back in the legal arena, Mrs. Caldwell's final hearings were drawing attention from across the state. Her federal charges were severe. Racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering carried mandatory minimum sentences. Her attempts to plead ignorance or deflect responsibility were met with unyielding scrutiny. District Attorney Sarah Butler and FBI Agent Rebecca Torres presented airtight evidence, leaving little room for doubt. For residents watching the proceedings online or attending the courtroom, it was a moment of collective satisfaction. The same woman who had caused years of stress and suffering was now facing consequences proportionate to her crimes. At home, families reflected on the past year. Parents explained to their children how speaking up, documenting everything, and working together had led to real change. The lessons went beyond HOA governance. They were lessons about courage, accountability, and community solidarity. Dinner conversations included strategies to stay vigilant, how to communicate concerns respectfully but firmly, and why standing together as a neighborhood was vital. Children learned that they could influence change, and parents realized that fear had been their enemy for too long. The media continued to spotlight Willowbrook's success. Local news outlets praised the community's resilience, and state coverage highlighted the educational programs designed to prevent future abuses. Tom Martinez was invited to speak at conferences about property rights, community organizing, and fighting corruption at the local level. The story of a small town that refused to be silenced became a case study in law schools, inspiring students to consider grassroots activism as a legitimate and powerful tool for justice, even outside formal channels. Willowbrook residents began networking with neighboring towns. They shared experiences, advice, and strategies for detecting potential fraud in HOA operations. Emails, phone calls, and online forums became avenues for exchange, creating a wider regional network dedicated to protecting communities from predatory practices. Families who had once felt isolated discovered that their struggles were part of a larger problem, and that collective action could provide solutions. The transformation extended into everyday life. Playground renovations, community festivals, and scholarship funds became hallmarks of a reinvigorated Willowbrook Neighborhood Association. Children played freely on new swings. Young adults attended local events with pride, and older residents felt secure knowing their voices mattered. Positive media coverage reinforced these changes, leading to a 15% increase in property values and an influx of families eager to live in a community known for integrity and solidarity. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees lining the lake, I walked along the familiar path by the water, reflecting on how far we had come. The loons called softly across the lake, their sounds now associated with calm and triumph rather than fear and unease. I thought of the countless small victories, a letter sent to a struggling neighbor, a conversation that prevented a new violation, a family finally able to pay off debts. Every effort, no matter how minor it had seemed at the time, had contributed to this new chapter for Willowbrook. Sitting on the porch later, I watched the lights of homes flicker on, one by one. There was a sense of normalcy, but also a profound shift. This was a town that had faced corruption, intimidation, and fear, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. Families gathered, neighbors spoke openly, and children learned the value of fairness and accountability in real time. The community had become more than just a place to live. It was a living example of the power of collective courage. Even as the legal processes continued, the spirit of Willowbrook had changed irreversibly. People were no longer afraid to question authority, to speak out against wrongdoing, or to hold leaders accountable. They had witnessed firsthand the consequences of silence and inaction, and they had chosen a different path. Conversations now centered on growth, improvement, and sustainability, with an understanding that vigilance was an ongoing responsibility, not a one-time effort. That night, I sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. It had been months of tension, legal battles, and emotional strain, but it was also months of learning, growth, and empowerment. Willowbrook had shown that even in the face of deliberate corruption, ordinary citizens could reclaim their power, protect their homes, and inspire change. The sound of the lake, the calm of the memorial garden, and the laughter of children playing together, all of it was a testament to the resilience of a united community. Morning light poured gently over Willowbrook, casting a golden glow across the calm lake. The air smelled faintly of crisp autumn leaves and distant wood smoke, a reminder of how seasons change. Yet some things endure, like the spirit of a community that had refused to stay silent. 6 months had passed since Veronica Ashworth's conviction, and the town now moved forward with a newfound confidence. But the lessons of the past remained vivid in everyone's minds. The Willowbrook Neighborhood Association had been completely restructured. Monthly meetings were now open to the public, with minutes posted online for full transparency. Leadership positions rotated annually, ensuring no single person could wield unchecked power. Residents actively participated, from checking financial reports to volunteering for community projects. Families who once feared retaliation now felt empowered to speak up, knowing they were backed by a network of neighbors equally committed to fairness and accountability. Tom Martinez continued his role as a community advocate, but his efforts extended beyond Willowbrook. He collaborated with state authorities to create a formal template for protecting homeowners against HOA fraud, ensuring other towns could benefit from Willowbrook's experience. Workshops, webinars, and local seminars educated thousands on recognizing warning signs, documenting disputes, and building coalitions to prevent abuse. Willowbrook's story had become more than a local victory. It was now a blueprint for citizen empowerment across the state. One crisp Saturday, the town hosted the first annual Willowbrook Community Festival. It was more than a celebration. It was a statement. Playground upgrades gleamed under the morning sun. Food stalls offered treats to every age, and local musicians played under banners that proudly read, "Strength in Unity." Families who had once endured harassment now mingled freely, sharing laughter and stories. Elderly residents strolled hand in hand with grandchildren, taking comfort in the knowledge that their homes, their rights, and their dignity were protected. The memorial garden became the heart of these celebrations. Fletcher's grandson, now an integral part of the town's planning committees, led a ceremony honoring local veterans, while recognizing the resilience of Willowbrook's citizens. He placed flowers at the granite stones, each petal a tribute to courage, both on the battlefield and in everyday life. Children, guided by their parents, learned about sacrifice, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The garden was no longer just a space of remembrance. It was a living classroom, a testament to the values that had seen the town through its darkest hours. Back in legal circles, the final pieces of restitution were falling into place. Every family defrauded by Veronica Ashworth received full reimbursement plus interest. Elderly residents paid off unexpected debts. Young families could finally breathe financially, and the community began investing in long-term improvements. The positive media coverage attracted attention from neighboring counties, inspiring other towns to audit their associations and implement preventative measures. Willowbrook had created a ripple effect, demonstrating that ordinary citizens could produce extraordinary change when they acted together. Personally, watching these transformations brought a sense of closure I hadn't realized I craved. The hand-hewn porch railings built by Fletcher still felt solid under my palms. Every morning, as I sipped coffee and watched golden sunlight dance across the lake, the loon's calls no longer carried unease. They carried serenity. Each ripple in the water, each leaf fluttering in the breeze, reminded me of resilience, unity and justice restored. Mackenzie, now preparing for college, reflected on how this experience shaped her worldview. Her essays chronicling the fight against HOA corruption had earned her multiple scholarships and acceptance letters. She had chosen State University's pre-law program with a simple, certifié, resolute explanation. I want to help communities fight back, but with better preparation from the start. Her dedication inspired her peers, teachers, and neighbors alike. The younger generation in Willowbrook was not just aware of injustice. They were equipped to confront it, learn from it, and prevent it. Even my relationship with my ex-wife healed in unexpected ways. Over long conversations and quiet reflections, we recognized that our personal growth mirrored the community's recovery. Watching you fight for something bigger than yourself answered a question I'd wondered about for years, she admitted one evening. It was a reminder that courage, compassion, and accountability could transform not just communities, but the people within them. Beyond Willowbrook, our story became a source of inspiration. Law schools cited the town as a case study in grassroots legal resistance. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Butler's regional Emmy-winning piece, Small Town Justice, captured the narrative of courage and resilience, proving that even ordinary people could challenge systemic corruption. Communities across the country reached out, seeking guidance, advice, and hope. Willowbrook's victory had grown into a movement, reinforcing the idea that standing together could defeat greed and abuse anywhere. The final act of closure came when Lakeshore Properties, implicated in supporting Veronica's fraudulent activities, was indicted for federal racketeering. Evidence collected from Willowbrook's meticulous documentation helped dismantle a criminal enterprise spanning 4 states. Our battle, initially local and personal, had grown into a national victory against corruption. Families across multiple communities were now safeguarded from financial exploitation. The impact of our stand rippled far beyond the borders of our small town. That evening, as I walked along the lake's edge, the reflection of autumnal trees shimmered in the water. I felt a sense of peace, but also responsibility. Willowbrook had won, yes, but the fight for fairness, accountability, and community spirit never truly ends. Every neighbor's vigilance, every family's courage, and every small act of honesty contributed to an enduring legacy. Finally, the voiceover-worthy moment came when I looked into the camera of my thoughts, addressing anyone who might listen. Ordinary people can achieve extraordinary change. Corruption only wins when good people stay silent. Stand together, stay informed, and never let fear dictate your actions. Your voice matters. Your community matters. And justice, even after years of struggle, is always worth fighting for. The town continues to thrive. New initiatives, playground upgrades, community festivals, scholarship funds, and transparent HOA practices define everyday life. Children play safely, adults share freely, and elders enjoy their hard-earned security. The loons still call across the lake, now a symbol of peace, resilience, and the triumph of unity. So, here's the takeaway. Whether it's a local HOA, a corporate scheme, or any system that tries to silence or exploit, ordinary people, when organized, informed, and courageous, can protect their homes, their families, and their values. Willowbrook is proof that the power of community can transform fear into strength and injustice into lasting justice. Thank you for watching this story of perseverance, justice, and community triumph. Share your HOA or local governance experiences in the comments below. Your story could help someone else stand strong. Hit subscribe for more tales where entitled individuals learn hard lessons and ordinary citizens discover extraordinary power. Remember, courage, unity, and vigilance are what safeguard our homes, our families, and our future. The loons call again across the lake, but now their song is of peace, of hope, and of communities that refuse to stay silent.